Among the great mysteries of the Christian faith, one theme intrigues scholars and believers: the letters of Paul that have not reached us. The apostle, known for his inspiring words and his essential role in the foundation of the church, wrote much more than what we find in the Bible. But where are these letters? Why are they not part of Scripture? What might they reveal about the early Christians and the faith that shaped the world? Get ready to understand a topic filled with discoveries and mysteries surrounding the letters written by the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul is considered one of the greatest leaders of Christianity and the primary author of the New Testament. Of the 27 books that are part of the New Testament, 13 were written by him, including important letters such as Romans, Galatians, and Corinthians, which profoundly influence Christian thought. However, what many people do not know is that Paul also wrote other letters besides those in the Bible. He himself mentions, in some of his writings, the existence of these additional letters. For reasons unknown to us, these texts were not included in the Bible and ended up being lost over time. These lost texts arouse great curiosity and raise several questions among scholars and Christians. What might these letters reveal about the life, teachings, and work of Paul? A well-known example is the so-called severe letter, which Paul wrote with great sadness and concern. He sent it to the church in Corinth with the aim of correcting serious errors, causing sadness among the recipients, but also leading to repentance. But what are these letters? What did they say? Why were they not preserved? Who decided to exclude them from the Bible? Some scholars believe that these letters were lost due to the historical conditions of the time, such as the fragile materials used for writing, the persecutions against Christians, and the limited circulation of these documents. Others think that these letters, although important, addressed specific issues already covered in other parts of the Bible, and therefore were not included in the official list of biblical books. Moreover, one curiosity remains. What would happen if these texts were found in our time? How would they be received by the Christian community? Would Christianity be shaken? These are precisely the mysteries and questions we will discuss in this video. Get ready for a journey through the life and work of Paul, his known letters, the lost texts, and the eternal impact of his teachings on the history of Christianity. Before becoming a Christian, the Apostle Paul was a dedicated Pharisee, known for his fervent opposition to the followers of Jesus. Everything changed radically when he had an encounter with Christ on the road to Damascus. This moment transformed his life, and Paul became one of the most committed apostles, dedicating himself entirely to spreading the gospel to both Jews and Gentiles. He traveled extensively throughout the Mediterranean world, founding churches and forming strong connections with the early Christian communities. Paul's contributions to Christianity are invaluable. His letters, which form an important part of the New Testament, are fundamental to understanding Christian theology. Although originally written to address specific problems within the churches of the first century, such as issues of moral conduct and doctrine, they also address universal themes that remain relevant to the Christian faith in any era. In his letters, Paul explained fundamental concepts such as justification by faith, the grace of God, and the importance of Christ's resurrection. These teachings had a tremendous impact on the early church, helping Christians face persecutions and resolve theological debates. Paul's letters were widely read and recognized by the early communities as inspired by God. Their inclusion in the New Testament demonstrates Paul's authority as an apostle and the lasting significance of his teachings for the Christian faith. Interestingly, Paul wrote other letters that were not preserved or included in the New Testament, something he himself mentions in his writings to the Corinthians. First, it is important to understand Paul's relationship with the church in Corinth, which was quite intense and full of challenges. Corinth was a very important city at the time, known for its trade, wealth, and great cultural and religious diversity. Paul visited the city for the first time during his second missionary journey, as recorded in Acts chapter 18. He came from Athens, where he had faced difficulties in preaching the gospel, and arrived in Corinth feeling tired and insecure. Paul initially planned to stay in Corinth for a short time, but after having a vision from God, he decided to remain in the city for about 1.5 years. During this period, he met Aquila and Priscilla, a Jewish couple who had been expelled from Rome by order of Emperor Claudius. Since they shared the same profession as Paul, tent makers, they began working together. This helped Paul support himself financially and avoided any doubts about his intentions as a preacher. Moreover, this partnership strengthened their relationship in ministry. Every Saturday, Paul went to the synagogue to preach, trying to convince both Jews and Gentiles that Jesus was the Messiah. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, they brought good news and support, which allowed Paul to dedicate himself fully to preaching. Despite this, he faced strong resistance from the Jewish leaders, which led him to focus his efforts on the Gentiles. Tensions rose when a group of Jews brought Paul before Gallio, the Roman governor of Achaia, accusing him of teaching people to worship God in a way that went against the law. However, Gallio decided not to get involved, stating that issues related to Jewish law were not his responsibility. This decision was significant because it allowed Paul to continue preaching without interference from Roman authorities, aiding the expansion of Christianity in the region. After this incident, Paul stayed in Corinth for a while longer before traveling to Jerusalem and Antioch, making a brief stop in Ephesus. During his time in Corinth, he maintained a strong connection with the local church, teaching Christians to grow in faith and addressing practical issues on how to live according to the gospel. An interesting fact is that it was during this period in Corinth that Paul wrote his letters to the Thessalonians. The first was a response to news brought by Timothy about the church in Thessalonica, and the second was probably written shortly after the first was received. Even after leaving Corinth, Paul continued communicating with the church, concerned about the challenges they faced in a city filled with influences contrary to the teachings of Christ. It's important to remember that the church in Corinth was experiencing many internal problems. There were divisions among the members, immoral behavior, legal disputes between Christians, and even confusion during worship services. These conflicts threatened the unity and good example of the Christian community. To help resolve these issues, Paul, while in Ephesus during his third missionary journey, wrote several letters to the Corinthians to guide and correct them. Records indicate that Paul wrote at least 4 letters to the church in Corinth. In the first letter to the Corinthians that we have in the Bible, in chapter 5, verse 9, he mentions an earlier letter in which he instructed the Corinthians not to associate with people of immoral behavior. However, this letter was not preserved and is considered one of the lost letters. Some scholars believe that parts of this lost letter may have been incorporated into the current first letter to the Corinthians in passages from chapters 6, 11, and 15. But this theory remains a topic of debate. After writing the first letter, which has been lost, the problems in the church of Corinth persisted. Paul learned about this through reports he received, and also through a letter sent by the Corinthians themselves, asking for guidance. In response, he wrote the letter we know today as the first letter to the Corinthians. This letter, preserved by God and included in the New Testament, directly addresses the problems, offering clear advice and correcting errors with love. Paul emphasizes the importance of unity among Christians, purity of life, love as a guiding principle, and the resurrection of Christ as the foundation of faith. Paul did not aim merely to correct wrong behaviors, but also to help the church grow in faith and Christian practice. However, his relationship with the Corinthians remained complicated and challenging. After sending 2 letters, one that was lost and another that is in the New Testament, Paul made what he referred to as a painful visit to the church in Corinth. This visit, not detailed in the book of Acts, is mentioned in his second letter to the Corinthians, in chapters 2 and 7. It is believed that this meeting was difficult, marked by conflicts and even challenges to Paul's authority as an apostle. After leaving Corinth feeling disrespected, Paul wrote another letter, which became known as the Severe Letter. We know of the existence of this letter because he mentions it in the second letter to the Corinthians. Paul says he wrote this letter with great sadness and concern, shedding tears as he sought to address the serious problems in the church of Corinth. This letter appears to have been so stern that it left many Christians in Corinth deeply impacted. In 2 Corinthians, Paul speaks about this letter with great emotion, showing how urgent it was. In chapter 2, he explains, "I wrote to you with great sadness and pain in my heart, with tears, not to make you sad, but to let you know how much I love you." In chapter 7 of 2 Corinthians, Paul continues saying, "Even if my letter caused you sorrow, I do not regret it. Although I was concerned at first, I saw that this sorrow was brief and brought good results." Some scholars believe that parts of this severe letter may have been incorporated into the current second letter to the Corinthians. Others, however, think it has been entirely lost over time. What is clear is how deeply Paul cared for the church of Corinth, demonstrating his commitment to helping the community grow spiritually and resolve its issues. Paul seems to have sent this severe letter through Titus, who was also tasked with observing how the Corinthians would respond. Later, Titus met Paul in Macedonia and brought good news. The Corinthians had repented and renewed their commitment to the faith. They showed genuine sorrow for their mistakes and reaffirmed their loyalty to Paul and the gospel. This change brought great joy to the apostle, who then wrote another letter to them, the fourth in total, which we know today as the second letter to the Corinthians, included in the New Testament. Later, it is believed that Paul visited Corinth once more. Some scholars suggest that it was during this visit that he wrote the famous letter to the Romans. Paul's lost letters to the Corinthians are not the only ones that spark curiosity. In his letter to the Colossians, in chapter 4, verse 16, Paul mentions another intriguing letter. He asked that after reading his letter, the Colossians share it with the church in Laodicea and, in return, read the letter that would come from Laodicea. This letter to the Laodiceans has been debated by theologians and historians for centuries, but its content and location remain unknown. Some people believe that Paul was referring to a letter written by the Laodiceans themselves, which was to be shared with the Colossians. However, this idea is questionable, as it would be strange for Paul to ask them to read a letter from another community without providing further explanation. Another possibility is that Paul wrote a letter while in Laodicea and sent it to the Colossians. However, there is no historical evidence to support this idea, and the text indicates that the letter was addressed to the Laodiceans, not written from there. The most widely accepted explanation is that Paul indeed wrote a letter to the church in Laodicea, which was meant to be shared with the Colossians. It was common in the early churches to exchange letters so that everyone could learn and be strengthened in their faith. But this leads us to a question: what letter could this be? There are a few possibilities. Some scholars suggest that the letter mentioned by Paul might be the one we know today as Ephesians. This idea comes from the fact that Ephesians has content similar to the letter to the Colossians and does not mention specific recipients, suggesting it may have been a circular letter sent to multiple churches. However, not everyone agrees with this theory. Another possibility, which many consider more likely, is that the letter to the Laodiceans was an epistle from Paul that was lost and never included in the Bible. Interestingly, in the early centuries of Christianity, a letter to the Laodiceans written in Latin appeared, found in ancient manuscripts, the oldest of which dates back to the 6th century. However, this letter is not recognized as authentic by scholars. Although this epistle to the Laodiceans circulated widely in the West, its authenticity was questioned by various church leaders. In fact, it is not certain where this letter originated. Some theories suggest that it may have been created by heretical groups such as the Marcionites to replace the letter mentioned in Colossians chapter 4, verse 16. The Muratorian canon, for example, cites a letter to the Laodiceans, supposedly written in Paul's name, but attributed to Marcion's sect. However, this letter does not contain teachings that support Marcionite ideas, which weakens this hypothesis. Another possibility is that multiple letters with the same name existed, which could explain the differences in the texts found and the varied interpretations. There were also attempts to reconstruct a possible original text in Greek, as the letter contains characteristics of the Greek language and does not seem to have been written directly in Latin. For this reason, some theologians believe this letter may have been a translation from Greek and even suggest retranslation to better analyze its origin. There is no concrete evidence that an original Greek version of this letter ever existed, and it is highly unlikely that such an ancient text would have survived to this day. The Latin epistle attributed to the Laodiceans, on the other hand, appears to be merely a collection of excerpts from Paul's known letters without offering any new or different information. It begins with phrases similar to those in Galatians and has some resemblances to Philippians. Erasmus, a renowned scholar of the 15th century, claimed that the best proof of this letter's inauthenticity lies within the text itself, as it does not hold up. Thus, Paul's true letter to the Laodiceans remains a historical and theological mystery. Despite some attempts to fill this gap using apocryphal texts, the authenticity of these documents is widely questioned and considered unreliable. What we know for certain is that in Colossians chapter 4, verse 16, Paul mentions a letter that offers a glimpse into how early Christian communities communicated and shared teachings. This raises some questions. What would the impact of Paul's lost letters be today? And what would happen if one of them were found? Although these letters have been lost, they demonstrate how active and committed Paul was to God's work. He dedicated his life to spreading the gospel and protecting the purity of Christian teachings. As a dedicated writer, it is likely that he wrote much more than what has been preserved in the New Testament. We know of the existence of at least 3 lost letters, but he may have produced even more. So far, biblical archaeology has found no definitive evidence that these letters still exist. However, this does not diminish the importance of research in this area. Each new discovery can shed more light on the context of the biblical world. Moreover, the fragments of the New Testament already discovered confirm the reliability and preservation of the scriptures we have today. Theologians and scholars agree that while it is interesting to imagine the content of Paul's lost letters, their absence does not affect the essence of Christian doctrine. The letters of Paul included in the Bible already provide a solid foundation for understanding the message of the gospel. The authority, inspiration, and sufficiency of the scriptures remain complete, even knowing that some texts written by biblical authors may have been lost. It is important to understand that the Bible is not incomplete because of these missing letters. Unfortunately, some people, without understanding the process of the Bible's formation, spread misleading ideas about banned books, as if a secret group decided what to include or hide from the public. But this does not reflect what actually happened. Paul's lost letters are not in the Bible because God, in his wisdom and sovereignty, did not allow them to be preserved. This shows us that the Lord, knowing all things, decided that these letters were not essential for our faith and understanding of the truth. Perhaps their content was already recorded in other parts of the scriptures, or maybe they were messages specific to the situations and contexts of the time, which were not necessary for future generations. If God had deemed these letters indispensable, he would have ensured their preservation to this day. Even so, the absence of these letters does not diminish the complete, perfect, and sufficient message of the Bible. The scriptures we have today have been carefully preserved by God throughout the centuries, ensuring that everything we need to know about Him, about salvation, and about how to live in a way that pleases Him is accessible in His Word. This process of preservation demonstrates God's loving care in providing people of all times and places with the tools necessary for faith and Christian practice. The letters of Paul that were preserved are a clear example of this. God allowed 13 of them to be kept and included in the New Testament, serving as a source of teaching, guidance, and inspiration for Christians in every generation. These letters address fundamental themes of the Christian faith, such as God's grace, justification by faith, the resurrection of Christ, the unity of the Church, and life in the Holy Spirit. They continue to be an incomparable blessing, helping us grow spiritually and better understand God's plans. Therefore, while it is interesting to imagine the content of the letters that were lost, we can have full confidence that nothing essential to our faith was left out. The Bible, as it stands today, is complete and inerrant, and is more than sufficient to guide us in our walk with God, give us hope, and prepare us for eternity. Now write in the comments, did you already know this curiosity about Paul's lost letters? Leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss upcoming content. May God bless you.